Yes, yes, I am. And Ira, I just wanted to mention that Saint Susanna's is absolutely on board. It's interesting to hear such dire news, which we do know, but somehow I think it, as you say, it's a burden, but to be able to do something makes sense. And your presentation was energizing in that particular way. We did put together a video last year in January, which is available on our website about the TPNW. It's about a half an hour long, and in fact, you are featured in it. And that is available for viewing and as a resource for other people who might want to use it in their parishes. And we do have the TPNW banner fastened to the entrance of our church. So there are reminders of what's going on. And of course, we have to do more. But we have begun, and people know that we are making those efforts. So thank you for unsettling us, but also for pointing us to responses we can continue to take. So now I'd like to introduce Eli. I don't see him on my screen, but I know he's there someplace. And Eli actually spoke at St. Susanna's a couple of weeks ago on nonviolent communication, which was wonderfully received. But I'll just tell you a little bit about him. Eli McCarthy and his family live in the DC area, where he is a professor of peace and justice studies at Georgetown University. He convened and coordinates the DC Peace Team, this since 2011, which provides training in nonviolent communication, restorative justice, and bystander intervention. It also organizes unarmed civilian protection deployments. Eli is a member of the steering committee of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and a chair of its education committee. The CNI is a project of Pax Christi International, which met at the Vatican in the spring of 2016 and was also co-sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. The intent was to call on the Catholic Church to take a clear stand for active nonviolence and against all forms of violence. It's a move from the idea of just war to just peace, with all of the implications in that movement. Recent publications of Eli include the books Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, A Virtue Ethic for Catholic Social Teaching and U.S. Policy, and A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence. He has written numerous articles that have appeared in NCR, America Magazine, journals, and online, elucidating his commitment to the gospel nonviolence of Jesus and a just peace ethic. I might recommend two articles given Eli's focus today on Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti in relation to racism, nuclear weapons, and the climate crisis. One is entitled Francis's Fratelli Tutti Weaves the Threads of Nonviolence and Just Peace, and the other, Breaking Out, the Expansiveness of Restorative Justice in Laudato Si. I entered the link already in the chat to that to the second article. I read that just a couple of days ago, and I found it just absolutely fascinating, and so worthwhile in the way Eli describes the application of restorative justice and just peace for all kinds of conflicts that exist in the world. It's a long article, but it's very readable, very much worth taking a look at. He is I think of Eli as an original thinker whose ideas, particularly in the Breaking Out article, resonate with the title of today's assembly, Remembering, Repenting, and Restoring, one we chose after a lot of discussion, concluding with the conviction that we must remember, seriously call to mind our culpability for the sins of the past and of today in order to repent and take responsibility for our failures and our hubris so we can creatively restore, heal, reconcile, and transform our relationships with one another and with our common home. In his work and writing, he opens doors of our minds and hearts to new rich ways of living our peacemaking vocations and healing our world. So Eli, we're happy that you're here. You've come from one thing and now you've had to run to us, and we're grateful.
Thank you so much, Pat. It's wonderful to be with you all. Good morning. I'm so grateful for the persistence and the creativity you offer, each of you offer to our church and our broader community. So thank you for creating this space and these patterns of engagement. This morning, I am going to invite you into a journey of reflection on Pope Francis's writing in Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. And in that context, we'll explore the Just Peace framework along with some intersections of systemic racism, nonviolence, and public health. And I'll end with some suggestions for Pax Christi in light of these reflections. So I want to begin with a story to kind of stir our imagination as we begin this journey and to maybe serve as kind of an icon for kind of connecting more deeply with how the Spirit is working in our world today. So let me share my screen, pull up a picture. So this is a story about Antoinette Tuff. And she was working in a school in Georgia around 2013. This was a middle school, elementary school situation. And this is a pretty intense story. So just kind of a heads up as we kind of unpack this. So it was a normal kind of school day, and she was in the office as a bookkeeper, and there were, kids in the classrooms and so forth. And this other person you see on the screen was able to kind of find his way into the front door and kind of broke into the office area. And on him, he had a big black bag that had weapons in it, and he had a pretty large gun on his shoulder. And he started to yell at everybody in the office saying, "Everyone's gonna die today, everyone's gonna die." People in the office are kind of screaming and hiding and trying to get out. The alarm goes off, the kids and the teachers get into their hiding spots, and some try to get out of the building. And Antoinette is there in the office space, and she does something pretty remarkable. The first thing she did, according to her testimony, was to try to center herself. And in her tradition, this was to say a short prayer. And it was out of that centering that she said she didn't see him as a monster or as irrational, but as another human. He notices her. He starts to yell at her. He goes, "Hey, you, get on the phone, get on 911, tell them I want the media here, I want the helicopters to see, get them out here now. This is big. So just before that, he had gone out to the window because the police had pulled up, and he started shooting at the police out the window, and they started shooting back. He came back in and he was pacing back and forth. And that's when he yells at her to get on the 911 call. And she gets on and she tries to tell them, but she notices that he's also on his own cell phone at this point. And she could tell it's whoever was on the other line seemed to be concerned about him, seemed to care about him. So she says this out loud. She says, "Well, it sounds like that person's really concerned about you. They really care about you." And she keeps trying to kind of distract him. And finally he's like, yeah, just leave me alone. And then he's like, okay, I didn't take my medicine this morning, okay? I didn't take my medicine. And continues to kind of pace So she gets back on the 911 call and she's, listen, you got to tell the police not to shoot him. Don't take him to jail. He's got to go to the hospital. Okay. You got to take him to the hospital. And she realizes, like, if he goes outside, he's probably going to get shot right away. So she says, she's like, listen, I'll walk outside with you. Okay. I'll walk outside, make sure they don't shoot you and they'll take you to the hospital. All right. I'll walk outside. He's like, shut up, lady, shut up. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. And then she starts to go a little bit deeper. She shares about some of her own struggles, her suffering. She says, listen, we all go through things. Like I went through a divorce and my husband treated me really badly and he did this and that. And I have a hard time raising a disabled son. And he's like, oh. And at one point he's finally like, oh yeah, your husband, you shouldn't have done that. That was messed up. That was messed up. He's still kind of pacing, trying to figure out what to do. And she keeps kind of working that line of shared struggle. And finally he's like, okay, just get on the intercom, okay, and tell the kids, I'm sorry for scaring them, okay? Just tell them that. So she does this. She's still kind of shaken and nervous, not sure what's going to happen. But she notices he starts to put some of his weapons down in the bag, and that he might be moving into a space of shame about what's happening. So she goes a little bit deeper and she tells him the story when she was about literally 1 or 2 steps from taking her own life. And it was in the depths of that vulnerability that he came out and said, my name is Michael. She's then able to get him to put down his final weapon on the counter. She tells the police they can come in. They come in shouting and yelling, pointing their guns, aggressiveness, hostility. But nobody gets shot. You can imagine if she had come at him with similar kind of aggression or hostility, threat, herself, maybe some kids or the police could have been shot, if not killed. So this is a short kind of summary of her story. There's a longer article in America about it, as well as a documentary called Faith Under Fire, which is about an hour and a half of the situation. So think about what you noticed in this story. What dynamic did you notice? What sort of tactics? And if there's anything particular, you can put it in the chat box for your colleagues.
I don't know if you see it, Ira, but from Tom Rupke, centering first, prayer is ground for action in the world.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. What courage, what creativity, what empathy, what power, what sense of seeing and being a gift. So in this spirit, let us turn to Pope Francis's writings in Laudato Si, where he calls out that many of us are enslaved by the technocratic paradigm, which exalts subjects who progressively control external objects, cultivating a habit and orientation of possessiveness. In contrast, we seek a habit and orientation of gift, seeing the gift of others and being gift in the world. Further, Francis goes on, he says, rich countries such as the US continue to often control and harm poorer countries through a, quote, ecological debt. For instance, quote, the warming caused by huge consumption on the part of some rich countries has repercussions on the poorest areas of the world, especially Africa, where a rise in temperature together with drought has proved devastating for farming. Also, these poorer countries, quote, fuel the development of richer countries at the cost of their own present and future, unquote. Bishops have asked, quote, what the commandment, thou shalt not kill, means when 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and the future generations of what they need to survive. Thus, differentiated responsibilities, he says, require the US to help by limiting consumption of non-renewable energy and assisting others in sustainable development. Another example of the technocratic paradigm more clearly displays the habit of possessiveness, as Francis links the activity of fossil fuels with our financial system in the activity of war. Francis notes that Pope John the 23rd's encyclical Pacem in Terris, quote, rejected war. Further, he says global inequality not only leads to the premature death of many poor, but also wars sparked by the shortage of resources, such as Sudan and South Sudan. He says, quote, might is right has engendered immense inequality and acts of violence, such as the war in Iraq. Too often power is guided by norms of alleged necessity from either utility or security. However, he says, quote, our freedom fades when handed over to such violence. He says, war always does grave harm to the environment, such as the water, soil, air, and the influx of disease. Engaging in war is not being faithful to the wisdom we are called to protect and preserve. In fact, he says, fraternal love can only be gratuitous. It can never be a means of repaying others for what they have done or will do for us. That is why it is possible to love our enemies. In this spirit, the more recent encyclical by Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, offers a critical step toward the illumination of nonviolence and a just peace framework. Reflecting on conflict and fear, Francis clearly names war itself, not merely terrorist attacks, as, quote, an affront to human dignity, unquote, which is the central orienting theme of Catholic social teaching. This opens the door for Catholics to more clearly recognize that nonviolence is a positive reverence for dignity and life, as well as what acting consistently with human dignity looks like in practice. Turning our attention to dialogue and friendship as a critical nonviolent ways of being, he highlights the importance of creating, quote, processes of encounter that build a people that can accept differences, unquote, rather than the violence of those who despise differences. These processes of encounter manifest the first category of a just peace moral framework, namely developing the virtues and skills to engage conflict constructively. In contrast, he says, every act of violence committed against a human being is a wound. Every violent death diminishes us as people. Violence leads to more violence. We must break this cycle, which seems inescapable. The recognition of how every act of violence cultivates a cycle of harm and violence illuminates the second category of a just peace framework, namely breaking cycles of destructive conflict and violence. Thus, to break such cycles of violence requires what he calls becoming artists and architects of peace. He focuses us on forgiveness, a critical spiritual discipline which is one of the just peace norms of engaging conflict constructively. Such engagement is about the power of nonviolence, as Francis reminds us of the one whom we follow. Quote, Jesus never promoted violence. He openly condemned the use of force to gain power over others. Therefore, quote, to be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence, unquote. At the same time, being called to love everyone, including an oppressor, quote, does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us. It means stripping him of a power that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. Such stripping of power is precisely what nonviolent force and resistance movements can enable us to achieve by focusing on diminishing key sources of power, such as material resources, intangible, kind of cultural, legitimacy, and capacity for sanctions, as well as impacting key pillars of support, such as religious leaders, business, and media. Francis is clear that, quote, we cannot unite by treating others with the same violence with which they treated us. He says nothing is gained this way, and in the end, everything is lost. So with this vision, we can more clearly see that war and the death penalty are, quote, false answers that ultimately do no more than introduce new elements of destruction, and that every war leaves our world worse than it was before. So Francis entitles an entire section called The Injustice of War, signaling that war itself is unjust and thus not an activity to suggest is consistent with the ways of justice. Quoting Pope John Paul the 23rd, or Pope John the 23rd, he says, it no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice. Francis elaborates on this writing, saying war is the negation of all rights and a dramatic assault on the environment, as well as inconsistent with integral human development. Likewise, human rights and environmental sustainability are two norms in the Just Peace framework's third category, building sustainable peace. Yet, Francis invites us beyond theoretical discussions for insight and to, quote, touch the wounded flesh of victims. He says, let us look at all those civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, those who suffered the effects of atomic radiation or chemical attacks, the mothers who lost their children, the boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear their true stories. Look at reality through their eyes. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil in the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive for choosing peace. So in the church's experiment of signaling that war or even defense by means of military force might possibly be justified under certain rigorous conditions, Francis highlights how this approach has been easily and consistently abused. He says, quote, war can easily be chosen by invoking all sorts of alleged humanitarian, defensive, or precautionary excuses, and even resorting to the manipulation of information. In recent decades, every single war has been ostensibly justified, unquote. Thus, these criteria are not functioning adequately in reality to prevent and limit war. Rather, the signal of possible justification inherent in them is too often enabling war. That may be sufficient reason to shift to another kind of moral reasoning and strategy. Further, when the increasingly destructive technologies that we see, Francis proclaims we can, quote, no longer think of war as a solution because its risk will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war, unquote. Notably, in the footnote to this sentence, he draws on Augustine and says, quote, who forged the concept of just war that we no longer uphold in our day, unquote. So what is going on here? Francis is acknowledging aspects of our tradition and yet planting some seeds for new insight and praxis. Reading the Spanish version, Professor Leo Guardado says that paragraph 258, the one about war, is like a passionate tango dance with carefully calibrated words that lead to Francis's final prudential judgment on this contested issue. Not no more unjust war, but rather never again war. Father Drew Christensen says, Pope Francis has taken another big step toward distancing the Catholic Church from its traditional support for just war theory. Marie Dennis says, I feel like what he is doing was moving the just war tradition further and further into the background to put it on a shelf where it belongs. It was progress in a very real way. Bishop McElroy says from San Diego, given this reality of Fratelli Tutti, in tandem with the teachings of Pope Benedict, it is hard not to include that the Church is abandoning the just war framework and seeking to construct a new moral framework that has not yet emerged. Bishop Taylor from Arkansas wrote an op-ed arguing for a shift to a just peace approach consistent with nonviolence. So Francis's critical reflection on war is coupled with the death penalty in some very intriguing ways. Francis grounds the inadmissibility of the death penalty not merely on practical terms, such as the abuse of the justification and practice, but he grounds it on human dignity. He says not even a murderer loses his personal dignity. In turn, with a firm rejection of the death penalty, we can better see how it is possible to recognize, quote, the inalienable dignity of every human being. That is, quote, if I do not deny the dignity to the worst of criminals, I will not deny it to anyone. I will give everyone the possibility of sharing this planet with me, unquote. So we might consider a similar logic when faced with a potential war or other violent actors. Thus, Francis asked, quote, Christians who remain hesitant on this point and those tempted to yield to violence in any form, to keep in mind the words of the book of Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. For us, this prophecy took flesh in Christ Jesus, who, seeing a disciple tempted to violence, said firmly, put your sword back, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword, unquote. Professor Dan Kosaki insightfully notes how Pope John Paul II's move to significantly close the space for possible justification of the death penalty is quite similar to what Francis is now doing with regards to justified warfare. On the death penalty, Francis took the next step from John Paul's insight to now declare its inadmissibility, and thus also the moral reasoning that could justify such violence through the death penalty. Likewise, we will see what transpires with the increasingly unsteady relationship between the Catholic Church and the moral framework of justified war. In the meantime, we have another gift from Francis to focus our attention, resources, and commitment toward active nonviolence and developing a new moral framework such as just peace. So let's move to a just peace ethic. So the Just Peace ethic focuses on kind of 3 categories of action. And the idea is that the actions or the strategies we choose should enhance or at least not obstruct the norms in these 3 categories. First one is virtues and skills to transform conflict. The second one is breaking cycles of violence. And the third one is building a more sustainable peace. So let me snag a couple links that I want to put in the chat box as we kind of go through this.
Eli, there are a few comments in the chat box too, just to make you aware. I can read them if you wish.
Okay. 1 second. So I'm putting in the chat box a link to the book, The Just Peace Ethic Primer, but also a short summary, like 2-pager on the Just Peace Ethic, and then a link to Pax Christi International's Policymaker Toolkit, which is utilizing the Just Peace Ethic and providing a bunch of examples of how policymakers can advocate for nonviolent strategies and approaches. So questions, isn't love your enemies the church's moral framework? Yeah, I mean, love your enemies is certainly a core value, right? It's a strategy, love your enemies, and there's a value there. So building out of that core, a moral framework that the Just Peace offers is consistent with that. It offers norms and sort of guidelines to help us kind of identify what are those practices, those actions, those strategies that manifest loving of our enemies. So let's unpack this a little bit and see kind of what it looks like. So the first kind of category here, virtues and skills to transform conflict. So the norms are sustaining spiritual disciplines. These are practices like prayer and meditation, forgiveness, virtuous habits, such as courage and hospitality, humility, empathy. Third, learning nonviolent skills and analysis. So, you know, these include things like the skill of nonviolent communication, but also racial analysis, intersectional analysis, strategic nonviolence campaigns. 4, participatory processes, including as much folks as key stakeholders as possible, particularly women and children. 5, forming nonviolent peacemaking communities, institutions, and cultures. The next category is breaking cycles of violence, and these are all on that second link that I put in the chat box. If you want to kind of look at that, you're welcome to. So the first norm here, reflexivity, trying to keep the means as consistent as possible with the ends, because we know the means ultimately become the seeds to the ends. This is where Gandhi was really critical in helping us realize that. Rehumanization through the language, image creation, and narratives we emphasize. Third, conflict transformation and dialogue to draw adversaries toward partnership, address root causes, such as trauma healing and independent initiatives to build trust. 4, nonviolent direct action, such as civil resistance, unarmed protection, civilian-based defense. 5, acknowledging responsibility for harm, such as restorative justice. And 6, integral disarmament, which is Pope Francis's particular phrase that he uses a lot to speak to how the sustainable disarmament requires kind of an inter-disarmament of our hearts and our bitterness towards others, along with simultaneously with the disarmament of weapons out in our world. And then the last category, relationality and reconciliation. Relationality is like the building of relations across different sectors. Second, robust civil society and just governance. Third, ecological sustainability. Fourth, human dignity and rights. And fifth, economic, gender, and racial justice with a focus on the marginalized and the vulnerable. So this kind of Just Peace framework arose out of conversations, particularly at the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative in 2016, where there are a lot of people from different violent conflict zones sharing their stories, making calls to the church, and so forth. And it was rooted in kind of trying to deepen our understanding and commitment to nonviolence. So here are some aspects that have come out of the past 4 or 5 years, particularly of conversations around the world about nonviolence. And one way to kind of consider this is that it is a positive. It is a positive reverence for dignity in life, as well as the constant effort to avoid dehumanization and participation in other types of violence. It's a way of life and a distinct virtue, a power of love and imagination and action, path to fuller truth, as well as to decolonization and justice, an intersectional approach, which I'll unpack a little bit in a moment, a strategic method, a constructive force for social justice, as well as protecting people in the common home and challenging different types of violence, structural and cultural violence. So, this arose out of global consultations, including folks from Iraq and Afghanistan, Palestine, Colombia, El Salvador, Mexico, South Sudan, Congo, Nigeria, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, as well as with Catholic ethicists and the Catholic theological ethics in the world church. So in turn, we're not describing or utilizing nonviolence as passivity, as quiet, or as a lack of conflict. It is not merely or primarily about individuals or intention. It is not merely or primarily about a lack of violence, nor is it merely or primarily a strategy or a tactic. It is not merely or primarily protest marches or civil disobedience. It is about engagement, confrontation, constructive conflict, social and structural transformation, and impact. It is primarily a positive and constructive program, as well as an invitation to a way of life orienting our relationships with others, self, God, and ecology. So let's move to the final section here, looking at some intersections with racism, nonviolence, and public health. From an intersectional perspective, what can a nonviolence lens help us see in relation to key signs of the times, particularly the public health challenge of COVID-19 and systemic racism? Since the public health challenge has taken so many lives, let's first consider this in light of the human need for security and thus related systems of power. The common way to develop US security strategies in the national sphere is to pay attention to troop movements and military buildup in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, China, Korea, Russia, etc. We attend to the latest weapons technology, nuclear proliferation, drones, planes, ships, deployments into outer space. The predominant ideas and frames in national security strategy documents have been resource competition, the US first, Americans first, economic and energy dominance, big power or military dominance. However, with this public health crisis, we face a reality drawing us to give the deeper needs and the less visible more of our focus in reimagining security. Because nonviolence entails the positive reverence for dignity and avoiding dehumanization, this lens can enable us to see our deeper human needs and the less visible reality more clearly, such as how violence often functions like a contagious disease. Violence is an energy and contagion of dehumanization, including domination and destruction. Violence, like a disease, clusters and moves through exposure. In turn, prevention of this vicious contagion, interrupting transmission with credible messengers, and shifting community norms become central strategies for security. In other words, nonviolence invites and challenges us to disrupt dominance and shift toward what Dr. Gary Slutkin of the Cure Violence organization calls a public health approach as a way of developing security strategies or alternative community protection. They apply this approach to shootings and homicides, and it's led to reductions in those actions by 40 to 70% on average in the neighborhoods they work in the US, Chicago, DC, New York, Philly, and so forth. With the experience of COVID-19, and by turning to a public health approach, we can better sense the less visible. That is, not only our cross-border interconnectedness, but also our deep interdependence. For example, we are deeply interdependent on our healthcare workers, adequate medical supplies, how others choose to prevent the transmission or not, and how other states and countries respond. With a nonviolent public health approach, we better sense how destruction and violence are rooted in systemic failures of public health. These include health inequity, educational inequity, environmental inequity. A public health approach calls us to focus on cultivating healthy persons, local communities, and cross-border relationships. In turn, we become more attentive to the well-being of those who have been less visible, i.e. on the margins of our communities, such as the elderly, persons experiencing homelessness, persons living in poverty, persons with impaired immune systems, with mental, emotional, or behavioral health challenges, without legal status, in prison, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Further, with a public health approach, we are more attentive to the intersections of less visible factors such as class, gender, race, and ability. In turn, our investments, priorities, and strategies would better reflect such attentiveness, especially in national security strategies and US foreign policy. This shift in national security strategy is also fundamentally embedded in and enabled by a shift of our gaze towards the question about how we flourish as human beings, and less about political interests, economic and military dominance. We need our national security strategies and foreign policy to become more oriented by this question, if they are to be more effective and relevant to our reality. The public health approach illuminated by nonviolence moves us in this direction. To enhance this movement and draw us further into this pivotal question, we can draw on that just peace framework for normative guidance. And racial justice, the skills of racial as well as intersectional analysis are crucial norms of this just peace ethic. So let us turn to systemic racism. Nonviolence helps us to see racism as a form of dehumanization and thus as violence, to identify systemic racism as structural violence, and to see the importance of naming as well as ending police violence. For example, referring to the quote, anti-Black narrative embedded in police violence like a contagion in our country, Kelly Brown Douglas explains that any narrative that dehumanizes or degrades another person is violent, and violence breeds violence. In turn, we are challenged to develop alternative community protection mechanisms. Regarding the naming of police violence, we often hear how the officers involved in killing George Floyd are regularly described as using, quote, excessive force, and the officer on his neck as having a history of, quote, excessive force. The Atlanta officers were fired for, quote, excessive force in responding to protesters. Police officers are being called to intervene if they see another officer using excessive force. Many advocacy groups promote reform of the use of force policies. Now, there is some truth in these descriptions, excessive force, use of force. However, there is more truth and power dynamics we are missing by primarily leaning on and reinscribing such descriptions. What we miss about truth and power can limit the persistent energy of our collective resistance and our imagination about concrete alternatives. One truth we may miss by descriptors such as excessive force is that killing people is a form of direct violence. It is destructive and dehumanizing, both to the one killed and the one doing the killing. For example, the advancing scientific acknowledgement of trauma, perpetrator-induced syndrome, moral injury, brain damage from killing illustrate this reality of dehumanization. It's also dehumanizing by obstructing empathy, failing to be gift to others, devaluing the sacred gift of others, and creating ongoing trauma in the parties directly involved, as well as other community members. Even if killing is considered legal, it is still violence. This is crucial because if we refuse to name killing as violence, then we may become collectively less resistant to it and may obstruct our imagination about alternatives in such situations. A deeper truth we may miss is that killing itself seems inconsistent with human dignity. This is part due to how it's dehumanizing, but also Lisa Cahill from Boston College argues that killing, quote, involves an offense against the dignity of life, even in difficult situations. She points out that killing is patently incompatible with love of neighbor in the example of Jesus, even if Jesus' example and teaching also urge us to take risk to help those in moral danger. Pope John Paul argued that violence destroys our dignity. Francis calls us to respect our deepest dignity and make active nonviolence our way of life. Another significant truth we may miss with excessive force or use of force descriptors is about the notion of force itself. When we regularly hear these in the context of armed police or military actions, then we may tend to devalue or miss the powerful force of nonviolent de-escalation tactics, nonviolent conflict and social movements, as well as restorative justice. Nonviolent conflict includes not only discomfort, but also confrontation, as well as non-cooperation, such as boycotts, strikes, tax resistance, civil disobedience. Research has shown that nonviolence resistance is 2 times more effective than violent resistance, and at least 10 times more likely to lead to durable democracy. Restorative justice approaches and programs in the US have significantly reduced recidivism compared to retributive justice models. We have numerous stories of the power and force of nonviolent de-escalation, such as Antoinette Tufts. We must recover more clarity with our language to explicitly identify violent force and nonviolent force. Some physical force could be adequately described as nonviolent force, such as that is constructive and humanizing. For example, if I push someone out of the street before they get hit by a car, or I hold someone back from beating up another person, or I physically block someone from harming another, or pull someone off another person, these could be examples of nonviolent physical force. However, if I use or I threaten to use a chokehold, knee to the neck, tear gas, rubber bullet, regular bullet, then I'm exercising violent force. However, there is a deeper, even more insidious intersectional truth behind the use of force curtain regarding policing. It is this: when we describe police killing in terms of use of force or excessive force, we too often reinscribe and help maintain established wealth and power in our society. Let us think about why those who engage in burning property, breaking windows, even pushing down police fences, get described as doing violence. And thus the claim arises that we need more law and order. Yet when police kill others, even unarmed others, the description is often an issue of use of force or excessive force. This truth may be less surprising when we consider how US policing, especially in the South, has significant roots in the system of slavery, i.e. systemic violence. Victor Kapeler explains the institution of slavery and the control of minorities, however, were two of the more formidable historic features of American society shaping early policing. Slave patrols and night watches, which later became modern police departments, were both designed to control the behavior of minorities. Meanwhile, a prominent, if not the primary characteristic of the origins of organized policing in the North entailed controlling labor, particularly using violence against strikers and union busting. Angela Davis says, a prominent institutional pattern of US policing functioning to maintain established wealth and power, even if not always intended, goes way back to the origins. This is how systemic racism continues to infect us and how destructive power operates. A nonviolence lens can contribute to us naming and more urgently addressing this systemic, institutional, and structural violence.
Eli, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to mention that we have a 5-minute warning at this point, okay?
Okay. I believe we are challenged to name and end both systemic racism and police violence, but also in doing this to recognize that racism is rooted in dehumanization and thus is not merely a sin, but a form of violence, whether that's systemic, cultural, or spiritual violence. Pope Francis says, my friends, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. He notes nothing is gained by the violence and so much is lost. So when we regularly name police violence and sense racism as a form of violence, as well as identify systemic racism as structural violence, I trust our collective resistance will strengthen and our creative imagination about alternative structures of protection will grow. So let me wrap up with just a couple comments about action steps. Alternative community protection. We mentioned the DC Peace Team is one version here in DC that's been doing this kind of work. This is some of the work we do is the training modules that were mentioned earlier, but also deploying unarmed civilian protection units to neighborhood situations, to political demonstrations, to even accompany people who have been getting death threats, like Cori Bush. We had a team in St. Louis providing unarmed protection for 6 months in 2020 to help her get through. She's now in DC. This is a picture of Columbia Heights Plaza, which is in downtown DC. And this is an area where the Neighborhood Commission has asked the DC Peace Team to be present because there's a number of folks who are disconnected from their family or other broken relationships, or they're undocumented, or they're drinking too much or have mental health challenges, and they tend to hang out here in this plaza. And there's a number of conflicts that come up, sometimes fights, police getting called in, people getting arrested, businesses upset because folks aren't coming to their business. So we've been deployed there every weekend from August till the present, building relationships with some of these, many of these are men and others, helping to connect them with resources like housing and detox, but also diffusing a number of conflicts. We've had about 40 de-escalations, including a number of fistfights that we've broken up, prevented a number of arrests, even de-escalated security officers who have been abusive verbally or at times physically. So this is one model of kind of creating those alternative community protection approaches. And as you might know, there's a Shanti Sena Network, which is a network of organizations in the US and Canada that provide unarmed protection. Probably some of you know the Meta Peace Team in Michigan and Portland Peace Team and Nonviolent Peace Force and Christian Peacemaker teams, Peace Brigades International, and Cure Violence. These are all part of this broader network. So, you know, for Pax Christi, just wanted to invite you to think about ways that you can invite people to participate in the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. We have a monthly meeting, usually I think every fourth Friday or the end of the month, that folks would be welcome to jump in. We plan different campaigns and strategies for scaling this up in the United States. Second, holding regular skill training sessions in nonviolent communication, restorative justice, bystander intervention, unarmed protection. Third, using the Just Peace norms for different cases. You can find examples in the book, but you know, if you write to publish these in the press, particularly a Catholic press, to help mainstream this kind of approach. Fourth, create a local peace team to deploy unarmed protection units in neighborhood situations or political demonstrations in your area. And, you know, we'd be happy to support with that if you needed it. Bishops, meet with your local bishop about the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative and propose, perhaps, if there's some opening, a pastoral letter on nonviolence. This becomes critical for kind of the groundswell where Pope Francis will draw on things that other bishops are saying around the world. And schools, get local Catholic schools to teach a unit at least on nonviolence and just peace, or colleges to teach a course on nonviolence as well. So I thank you for your time. I really appreciate your patience and your openness. And again, all the wonderful work you've been doing in this area for so many years. I've learned a lot from what you've already done, and I'm inspired and encouraged to keep being involved because of that. So peace be with you.
Thank you very much, and really appreciate it.